At this time, let's begin today's webinar, The Changing Role of Internal IT, How Accelerating Cloud Computing Drives Strategic Initiatives, sponsored by Netgain and hosted by Accounting Today. I would like to introduce your moderator for today, and that is Ronica Arrowsmith, Technology Editor for Accounting Today. With that, Ronica, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. We're jumping right into the changing role of internal IT here today. But before I do introduce our speakers, I want to make sure everyone knows how to get their CPE certificate. I'm going to go through this slide really quick with instructions. Horizon, Accounting Today's parent company, is pleased to be able to offer CPE for this web session. It is imperative that you adhere to the following instructions to obtain your CPE credit. First, to obtain the credit, you must be in attendance for a minimum of 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. No credit will be awarded from watching the replay. Accounting Today is not responsible for late arrivals or connections issues. Secondly, there will be required polling questions asked periodically throughout this session, all of which you must answer. Please remember to click Submit after choosing your answer. So just remember to answer the polling questions as they come up. That way, you'll be sure to get your CPE credit. Thirdly, if you've completed the above, allow up to 3 business days from today to receive an email from simplecert.net. That email will contain instructions on how to download and print your CPE certificate. Just to make sure you get that email, just add simplecert.net to your safe sender list so it doesn't get lost in the junk. So that's your instructions for CPE, and without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We have Kate Krupey, who is a principal consultant with CoreBlue Advisory, and Bill Sorenson, Vice President of Product for Netgain, and I will let them introduce themselves more fully. Kate and Bill, take it away.
Very good. Thank you so much. So I'll get started. My name is Kate Krupey. And as I was graciously introduced, I'm the Principal Consultant for CoreBlue Advisory. My background is I was the CIO with a firm in Maryland for 10 years, where I led their technology team and their change management group. Now I work with firms across the country in an advisory capacity, supporting technology and security programs and helping IT transform into higher value business teams within firms. Bill?
And I'm Bill Sorenson, Vice President of Product for Netgain. I've really been focused on moving organizations to the cloud almost for the last 20 years, really focused on accounting firms and the accounting industry for the last 15 or so. And have spent a significant amount of time talking about cybersecurity and that impact on organizations as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So for today's agenda, we're going to go over kind of IT roles and responsibilities and the changes that we're seeing. The impact of COVID, obviously that's changed a significant number of things that each organization is doing, and we don't know how that change is going to play out in the future, but we'll go over kind of what we've seen. Next is what the firms and organizations need from their IT staff today. You know, as we look at how things have changed, how the cloud plays into that around strategic advantages that organizations are taking, and then we'll look at next steps and how partners can really help in that. Let's go ahead and get started, Kate. I'll have you just jump in with how you're seeing IT roles and responsibilities change.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. So over the past number of years, really year by year, we see the roles and responsibilities inside of IT organizations just grow and grow. There's any number of different reasons, but some of the major ones are the expansion of technology that's used inside of organizations, including the application set. We see just additional applications being consumed and adopted in different organizations, especially in the CPA industry. Many of them are client-facing. There's a number around automation or even AI. And as we continue to add applications, we continue to have to support more and more applications. An interesting group would be the group that's coming up through Microsoft 365. So many people have adopted Teams very organically and SharePoint behind it, and a number of the other tool sets inside of that. That presents a particular challenge for IT departments because in many cases, the end users are out there using it and defining the use cases themselves before IT is even ready to support it. And then there's a lot of very interesting applications like Power BI that folks are starting to or have moved along in their implementations and using those. And then in the CPA world, we have and this is sort of a constant, while other things are growing, where roles and responsibilities are growing, we have a very bright group of end users that we support. And it's so the time that they require to solve the type of problems that they have is more than the average in other service industries. Bill, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we're seeing really, really sharp user groups start taking advantage of these extra tools that, they've got at their fingertips now, even with just the Microsoft 365 or Office 365 environment. Many of the organizations are using Power BI to pull data out of, their core applications, getting production data, understanding performance data of their staffs. And so, that expansion, many times the IT group is either a little behind that or really needs to focus on the capabilities around that. Let's go on and take a look at really how that security expansion is happening as well.
Right, good point. So as security vectors, threat vectors continue to exponentially expand, that part of the roles and responsibilities inside of an IT group continue to be very demanding and continue to grow. Some of it is around additional software, again, that needs to be mastered and maintained. But there's also other roles around vulnerability management and risk management that add to the daily tasks that an IT department is responsible for. And, part of that is disaster recovery and business continuity. Over the years that I've been looking at this really went from very basic exercises of making sure that you could get main systems back up and running sort of manually to a much larger part of what an IT department has to do. There's a lot of planning that goes into a full disaster recovery program, and certainly the business continuity that goes along with it includes a lot of work within the business itself to make sure if there is a disaster, everyone can come back, in a reasonable amount of time and get business going again. So that's become much more formalized in a lot of ways, a lot more cost effective, but it does put another demand of time and responsibility on that IT group.
Yeah, I think if we look at the bottom two items there, real risk management and being concerned about the organization's risk profile and managing risk is a key piece as compliance escalates now state by state. We're seeing incident response needs around that. And then on the disaster recovery side, you can look at the beginning of COVID at the end of March as really a test that happened almost for everybody in the country. How quickly can we have and support remote workers while continuing to do production? And so we all had this opportunity to go through that and really learn from that, hopefully. So as our roles change and expand, accepting those roles around risk management and real disaster recovery, are key to an organization.
Okay, I think we have our first poll question.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Kate. This is Veronica again. I'll go through our first polling questions for the audience. Just a reminder to the audience, please do remember to answer all the polling questions so that your CPE will be counted. I'll go ahead and read this question here. How much have the roles and responsibilities changed for your firm's IT department over the last 3 years? A lot. Our IT department's roles and responsibilities have grown dramatically in the last 3 years. Just a little. Our IT department has had to add some roles and responsibilities, but has not changed dramatically in the last 3 years. Or the third option is not at all. Our IT department has not changed over the last 3 years. In order to answer the question, just make sure you click the radio button to the left of your selection. And then on the bottom, there's a submit button right there. Just make sure you click that button for your answer to be counted. These are anonymous polling questions, so you can feel free to be honest. And I just want to make sure everybody has time to answer the question, which is why I'm moving it up for a few seconds. Once again, how much have the roles and responsibilities changed for your firm's IT department over the last 3 years? The options are a lot, a little, or not at all. While you answer that question, I'll also remind attendees there is a Q&A box. If you have questions while the presentation is being given, you can type it right in there, and we will try to get to them at the end. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and count down from 5, so make sure you get your answer in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everybody. And it looks like just about half of our attendees are saying that the role of the firm's IT department has changed a lot. And before I delve too much into this, I'll just hand it back to Bill and Kate if you want to go over these results. Please do.
Sure. So let's, so if we look at the overall piece, just under 20% feel they haven't changed at all. I think, Kate, as you look at this, most are seeing some of the changes. 3 years is a significant amount of time, and part of that aligns with, as people have gotten rid of equipment or really kind of leaned into the move to the cloud.
Good point. And I think that, some of this is inevitable too in the security, in the world of security. There's no choice but to evolve there. But one of the things that we see that's a real issue is capacity isn't really changing in the IT department. So while all of this is being sort of piled on, they don't always have time to really dig into some of these other efforts, including security. So I wonder with some of the ones who haven't changed much, if it has something to do with not really having the capacity.
You bet. Yeah, it's an interesting question and kind of a follow-on is, if you haven't seen that change, is it really because technology hasn't changed for you during this time much? Let's move on to kind of the impact of COVID, and we're going to talk about COVID a little bit throughout this. And really here, we're focusing on kind of what's happened to the human element. And when we think about risk and we think about security, we talk about administrative controls, policies and procedures that we want our employees to follow to keep them safe, keep the firm safe. And so we've sure seen as people have moved home, the risk in this threat vector, kind of that concept that your organization, its boundaries expanded dramatically, and they really expanded outside of your normal purview. And so to address that, we've updated HR policies, or you need to take a look at that. Your exposure, either for bring your own devices or people's offices at home, where now we're having many children doing partial schooling from home, possibly sharing the same rooms, and really thinking about updating that security policy within your organization. I think a lot of people have done that to date, but I know we've seen examples with employees leaving an organization or a firm and how that's changed.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. We definitely have seen firms who have had unfriendly terminations early in the COVID timing and weren't yet prepared for how to manage that, how to make sure that all of the firm data or company data and client data was sort of, we put our arms around it from a security standpoint and equipment and got it all back. By now, probably many organizations have been through that process, but may still need to update written policies and procedures and go through that thought exercise of figuring out how do we manage the whole life cycle of an employee when so many of them are working from home. And even something as simple as, what about, are they printing client data in their homes, and how are they destroying that information?
You bet. Yeah, and I think, as firms move back or partially move back, we're going to see some, concerns around moving data back and forth and back and forth. We've had some of these in the past, but nothing to this level. Well, let's go on and take a look at, IT's alignment with firm strategy.
Absolutely. So as firms start to really adopt more and more technology, which is a trend that's been happening, obviously well before COVID, in order to run their firms and run their organizations, the need for some of the skill sets that are inherently in IT has become greater. So, for instance, as you are looking at adopting new technology, let's say around automation, or maybe around AI, or maybe just around process, the IT skills of project management and vendor management and solution assessment are really needed more deeply in the business to help organizations become more elegant about their change management and about adopting new technology. They really need that technology acumen and vernacular to help with assessing anything that they're doing moving forward. So in firms, we often have champion groups around certain areas of technology. And I've seen more and more the need to bring IT into those groups in order to make them more successful, but also to help really more quickly advance the adoption of these new technologies, which is always critical.
I think the growth in firms through mergers and acquisitions, and we're seeing kind of a spike in that this fall, bringing IT in, and we'll talk a little bit about how the cloud impacts that as well, but making sure they're in early helps reduce risks of unknown costs later. And so I think we sure see the value of that as well. It's
absolutely. Yeah.
It's really moving the internal IT groups from tactical responders to including more productivity enhancers and really focusing on strategic alignment. So let's go ahead and take a look at how cloud strategy can help that. I think, Kate, as you're talking about this, just that idea of, as things get more complicated and higher level things are needed in the IT group, how does a cloud strategy help?
Right, that's such a good point. And so the idea of leveraging a cloud strategy to help is to create capacity. So it's really around figuring out what is best done by an internal IT group and what is really best done by a partner, by a vendor partner who could do a lift. So for example, while we've been talking about all of the ways that the roles and responsibilities have grown and what the firms really need, there are things like, for instance, Windows updates or backups or any number of other sort of tactical things that IT departments currently are responsible for and really take a lot of their time that really could be done by a partner. And that's one of the things that you can do. That's one way to create capacity. Now, there are many, we'll look at sort of a fuller stack of things that can be managed by a partner. But the idea is the IT department really should align with what the firm, where the firm is going strategically. And the work they do should be supporting that. And the way to create the capacity really is to offload the things that aren't moving in that direction and can be done by another organization, and many times better, because let's go back to backups and Windows updates. Those are things that, you know, anyone on the line who's part of an IT department knows no one gets excited about those tasks. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the real focus is, can we make these internal IT groups strategic? We've got really good, skilled project resources that can be used within the organization to focus on productivity within the organization. And so by looking at what tasks and what level of responsibilities can you move off, whether you move it to a cloud provider or you move it to a service provider, and we'll look at that in the next slide. It's really taking a look at what's most important to the firm. The other piece, and we've talked about it a little bit, is really understanding risk management more. Many CPA firms, typically aren't directly under compliance. Some have wealth management, and so there's a reach into the firm around compliance and the SEC's interest in compliance. But really, as we look at our own individual organizations, having a really strong risk profile and risk management, and then understanding as part of that where you move risk and taking advantage of that. I think that's a key piece as well, Kate.
That is a key piece, and actually brings us to our next slide pretty nicely. There we go, which is about shared responsibility. So while we're discussing working with partners to help do some of the lift and take some of the tactical work, it's just essential that an internal IT staff stay very much engaged and share that responsibility with whatever partners they have. And some of the areas, while some things lend themselves very well to be taken care to being offloaded, I'm using the wrong word here, but to a vendor partner, it's just essential that we keep internal. So the responsibility, for instance, for security, or the responsibility for how we organize our data, that really needs to stay with the firm. And working with a vendor where you can have that sort of shared responsibility and define those roles very clearly is really the secret to success in working with a vendor to help create that capacity for you.
Yeah, I think this outlines a nice breakdown of, transferring responsibility to different areas. And really, the other thing I wanted to mention on this is that many organizations feel that if they move to a cloud solution or a vendor-provided cloud solution, that they've washed their hands of responsibility for things. And, we just want to have everyone understand that, around confidentiality of your data, around access of your data by your employees, those administrative controls, what do you allow employees to do, you're going to always own that, whether that cloud's being provided in the public cloud or private cloud. You do see that middle section, and Kate, let's talk about that a little bit, where there's a shared responsibility between the internal IT group, and a managed cloud service provider. Let's go through those.
Absolutely. So, well, we were talking about sort of that top section of this slide continuing to be managed by the internal team. This next section that you're talking about, really the things like employee onboarding and offboarding. That's a great example of where there's a shared responsibility. While the tactical work can be done by a partner, what needs to be done has to be defined by the organization, and the ultimate responsibility obviously lies with the organization to make sure that the planning is done properly and all of the controls are managed properly. And that's really where you're leveraging your partner to do the tactical piece while you're still doing the strategic piece.
Yeah, exactly. I think, we see this, and we bring it up later in the presentation as well. We see as it's associated with applications, application updates, application maintenance, input on applications by having cloud service providers who really understand your industry. That gives you this huge leg up in, how do you manage those applications, getting the best performance for your users out of those applications. We've sure seen that on kind of practical levels, with specific applications that our clients need and love, that really by understanding them and really being close with those application vendors, that ability to help that perform as good as it could anywhere, is really high on the list. But again, that's a shared responsibility, and developing that relationship with, from your internal IT group to that managed cloud service provider is key as well. We sure don't want you to have this, and we would call it a vendor relationship, where, you pay somebody, they provide some service, there's a little bit of a break there. It's not a relationship. The way we see things be really successful for clients and, really for the firms, is when that internal IT group feels that the service provider is an extension of them, that they can have good discussions around direction, that they can get brought in on strategic areas. And so I think there's a lot of value, as you look at that overlap in combining those two groups so they feel extended.
That's a great word for it, extended. Yeah.
Yeah, thinking back as you worked with your group and different vendors, maybe talk about where you saw that be successful and what that looked like.
It absolutely is when you have a partnership with your vendors, and you can really, you really are extending. So whatever the size of your IT group and whatever their skill set, to be able to leverage an IT partner where they have, a greater bench of security strength, a greater bench of networking strength, and even support strength. That's where you really see it become successful. And of course, the key is communication. It's communication is always the key, even when everything is internal. But as you start leveraging these external resources, making sure that, again, not looking at it as a vendor, but as an IT partner, and making sure both sides of that equation see it that way, that really helps when it comes to communication, so that you don't wind up in a finger-pointing situation.
Exactly. And that's a situation that takes both sides and a commitment and interest to get that done. Well, let's move.
I will say
move on to
just
that.
One more thing about this.
Go ahead.
Just one more thing about this slide, Bill, is what I love about it is it really shows you the capacity that can be created. You can really see sort of that second column under cloud. You can see what is now being lifted from the on-prem team to create that capacity for them to work more deeply in the organization.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the next pieces we're talking about. I think it's time for the next poll question.
Another poll. Here we go. Okay, everyone, here we go. Our second poll question is up. What is your highest concern around cloud platforms? With several options. First, security. Trusting sensitive data to a third party is hard to stomach. Is it performance? Tying the firm's performance to a service provider's performance is difficult for you. Loss of control over provisioning, deprovisioning, and operations of infrastructure. Implementation complexity. We don't have the time or resources to devote to a project of this size. Or all of the above is also an option. So once again, your highest concern around cloud platforms. Is it security? Is it performance? Loss of control over certain operations of infrastructure? Is it implementation complexity? Don't have the time to dedicate to that. So go ahead and make your selection. As a reminder, click the radio button to the left of your selection, scroll down and click that submit button so we can count your answer. I'm looking at the Q&A panel here while everyone answers questions. We have a couple questions coming in, so that's good. Keep them coming, and we'll get to them at the end. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and count down from 5 for this question, so make sure you get your submission in on this question. What is your highest concern around cloud platforms? Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everyone. I am closing the poll. And here we go. Bill and Kate, the results are up for you. A lot of people said all of the above. I don't know if you expected that, but back to you.
Thank you. It's good to see that security is the focus for the for the individual ones. But I think you're right, Ronica, that all of the above plays into this. And Kate, I think that's what we hear as we talk to clients and people in the industry.
It certainly is. It certainly is. It's I think loss of control really was higher on folks' list. I think that the confidence in the cloud is starting to is growing sort of organically as time goes on, as you would imagine that it would. But there is a little bit of all of it for sure for most firms.
Yeah, and it's actually nice to see that implementation complexity is low. I think that's been historically another piece where we've seen organizations worry that it may take 3 years to move to the cloud. So let's move on and take a look at that acceleration to adoption.
Right. So that is a nice transition here. There is a lot of confusion around what exactly it would take to make the lift to the cloud from an infrastructure point of view. And it's really not as complicated as firms fear it's going to be. A good vendor or we're going to start using the term partner now, a good partner will do most of that lift. It takes a lot of work for the IT department, and one of the reasons it takes a lot of work is it's a great opportunity to start fresh instead of bringing over anything that was problematic about a network, let's say in group policy or profile management or sort of anything that generally becomes messy over time. This is a really good time to clean that up and walk into a clean, fresh environment. So there is some work ahead of time for the IT department to do. But for the end users, it really looks a lot like Friday night, at a predetermined time. Friday night when they finish work, they shut down and don't log in that weekend. And Monday they come back and they're in a new environment. That environment is usually a Windows 10 environment, so it doesn't look a lot different or feel a lot different. So that transition for the end users is really good. And so just to assuage some of the fear out there about that, about the effort that it would take or the disruption really. And key here is testing. So the more testing that's done by the right people in that lead up to that cutover, that's really what makes it successful. So having the right folks that use all the different types of applications, depending on what kind of organization you are and how many different business units you have, you want everyone, a sample of each of those really to be testing thoroughly as if they were really doing work. And when we see that, we see really smooth transitions on that cutover weekend.
I think the interesting thing too, just in, working with, maybe even a couple hundred organizations that have gone through this, the cleanup lets you really go through all the employees that have ever left and finally clean up their stuff. We've seen where, there hasn't been significant updates or changes for maybe 5 years. And so finally getting to a brand new clean start, helps the organization kind of get their arms around, who's got really access to what. I think the other piece that it lets people do is really understand who has access to what. And as confidentiality and control and GDPR, or what we're seeing out of California and Arizona and Massachusetts and New York, is really organizations need to understand who has access to what and why. And so this gives a nice clean method to take a fresh look at that and be successful in, your internal data governance needs. And ultimately that helps being successful to your client. So
that's a good point. That's a good point. I would add to that, before you roll, I would add to that, it's a really nice time to look at your data set as well. And for IT folks, it can be exciting to have a line in the sand on a project like this, because there's just rarely time to take a nice deep look at all of your data, where it is. We all have this sense that there's data to be cleaned up somewhere, but that project doesn't usually rank high on our list. So this is another opportunity to look at your data sets, find duplicate data, find data that needs to be archived, or even update your data retention policy as a part of a move like this to help clean up sort of older data of less value or maybe some risk. So I just wanted to add that, Bill.
Yeah, you bet. And that's a good lead into, this discussion of cloud and cloud types. As we've moved people and helped organizations adopt the cloud, a big piece of that is this old data. What do you do with it? And there's, just to add to that, there's kind of two ways. One is people keep things forever, whether that's email or old client data, and because they, quote unquote, may need it sometime. But the other piece is old data is then discoverable, and we have a tough time predicting the future, and so having good, strong data management policies, helps protect the organization long term as well. So it's a good time to take rigorous look at that. Well, let's take a look at, and we're going to use Microsoft Azure here as the example of public cloud versus private cloud. So as we talk about private cloud, that might be a hosting location where you might be renting space. You have some computer racks there, maybe your equipment's there, and that's a private cloud. Another version is some vendors have acquired that equipment for you, and it's in a rack, computer rack that they control, and they present that to you as a private cloud. And really, here we want to talk about what those differences are between what a Microsoft Azure public cloud would offer you versus a private cloud. And a lot of things around that get around security and performance and this ability to scale at whim. The nice thing about the private or public cloud is you ultimately pay for what you use. You grow, you add additional people, you add additional firms, you pay for that. You shrink, your expenses get reduced. the capacity of these private clouds, or excuse me, the public cloud is just unbelievable when compared to the private cloud. Public cloud capacity gives you unimaginable growth. It's an interesting picture. This is the inside of the Azure Chicago data center, and all you see is shipping containers. And each one of these shipping containers is racks and racks of computer gear plus storage, and these are built specifically for Microsoft. And the way they work is when they expand these or expand their footprint, they literally just drop down these shipping containers and plug them in, and the capacity immediately is available. Then on the other side, they have so much redundancy that as issues happen and are automatically, replaced with other resources, and typically those are things where organizations that go to the public cloud really don't see those issues. At some point, this shipping container may have a fault level that's too high, and they remove it and drop in another one. So it's just fascinating, this kind of liquid capacity that's available. The other piece is these public data centers are all over the country and all over the world, so getting access to resources that are close to where you are, or if you're a larger organization with footprints across the country, the ability to have your computing resources close to where your employees are helps with speed and performance. The other piece, a couple of years ago in the CPA industry, there were a few very, very public ransomware issues that happened in the private cloud, and what occurred was that an individual had gotten this ransomware, and then it spread sideways to other clients. And that's one thing that in a Microsoft Azure world, your subscription, your tenant, as they call it, is just yours. Kind of the difference of having a house versus, renting an apartment in a big building. Your protection is dedicated to you, and that's been really a huge improvement, as well as, quite honestly, the security. Nobody can scale security like Microsoft can around their public cloud. To add to sort of on a more granular level to the scaling that I think is really interesting is, having managed on-prem networks for many years, working in Microsoft Azure now, and being able to literally add resources with a couple of clicks of buttons, and then, being billed for that, as opposed to trying to predict what you're going to need in terms of process and compute power, have it, order it, install it, do it all at the right time of the year so you're not impacting, negatively impacting your user base. I mean, it's just so amazing. It reminds me of when we went, many of us went to Office 365 was what they called it then, and no longer had to manage Exchange or Exchange backups. It was like a collective sigh across the world of IT. Exactly.
And this is sort of the same power of being able to have the flexibility.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point. We all used to have a crystal ball. We'd close the door after we heard about what growth numbers were. We'd look in the crystal ball, and then we'd try and come up with leases for the next 3 years. We always did hardware leases on 3 years, and typically we were wrong. We'd try and get close, but the firm would grow faster or things would change, and it's tough both for the partner side as well as the IT side in trying to predict expenses. You get real predictability here.
Right. Yeah. So next step for cloud advancement. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's dive into what do we do now.
So as you're preparing, as you're starting to think about this, if you want to make a move like this, here are some real concrete steps that you'll need to take. One is an application inventory, really understanding all of your applications. And I'm gonna pair the first bullet point and the last one together, the cost review. When you're looking at costs and your application inventory, I recommend taking a look at your general ledger over the past 3 or 4 years. That'll help you capture costs that don't come up annually. And as for applications, it just seems inevitable. Every firm that I work with, you think of the top 10, the top 12, but you look at that general ledger and then you see the other 15 that you forgot about that are only, have a smaller usage but definitely need to be accounted for. So that's one trick that seems to work for a lot of firms is to take a look at that over 3 or 4 years to put together that cost review and that application inventory. Also knowing what is your firm's direction around applications. Are you moving more towards SaaS applications, more towards fully integrated suites? Are you moving towards best in class? Those are helpful things to understand about your organization. And then knowing your data footprint, and that sounds like an easy task, but it is not always because there's all sorts of different pieces to that. So you want to look at really what is your file folder type data and maybe your user profile type data without VMs or other things that you may be looking at if you're looking at a backup as your tool to get that data set size. And then reviewing your network design. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on the application side, there's a number of applications that you end up not needing anymore, and so identifying those that'll go away, will help with that cost review.
Good point. Oh, that's a very good point. Like your virtualization software or your, a lot of times the Windows Server licensing, for instance, will be, included when you're moving to a cloud design. So that's a really good point, Bill, looking at those things that you think will go away and then validating that with your IT partner.
Right.
Speaking of IT, of your partner.
Yeah, and, as we finish here, we really think that, the goal here is to look for an IT partner, somebody who's very, very aligned in your industry, knows the applications that you're using, has really good relationships with those software providers of those applications. So they're really plugged in. I think where we see people struggle is if they don't choose someone who has that alignment, there's really a significant struggle with support and support of the users. So that's a key piece.
I couldn't agree more. I've seen this fail many times with firms who go to a local managed service provider to try and move to Azure with them. And a lot of local MSPs for our firms are doing just that. But if they haven't dealt with some of the applications that we work with in Azure, we see it fail quite a bit. You really want to work with an organization that knows the applications of your industry and has already done the work of figuring out how to optimize them in the cloud.
Well, let's go on to that last poll question.
Yes, here we go, everyone. We have our next polling question up here. And thank you for bringing the questions into the Q&A panel. Keep sending them in as we wrap up. We're going to do our Q&A session after this. How does your firm leverage vendor partners or managed service providers in terms of developing IT strategy? That's our question here. How does your firm leverage vendor partners or managed service providers in terms of developing IT strategy? So our options are: our firm manages everything in-house, our IT vendor partner or MSP manages IT but provides no strategic input, or they execute against our strategy but provide little guidance, or our IT vendor partner or MSP is a consultative partner that helps advance our firm's strategy. So those are your options. I'm going to leave that. No, we should finish this question before we go on, so I'll go ahead and read those options again. How does your firm leverage vendor partners or MSPs in terms of developing IT strategy? The firm manages everything in-house. They manage IT but provide no strategic input. The partners execute against the strategy but provide little guidance, or they are a consultative partner that help advance our firm's strategy. I'm going to go ahead and count down from 5 so we can get to our Q&A session. Remember to click your submit button when you do your selection. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everybody. I'm closing the poll now. There you have it. It's quite a spread. Bill and Kate, do you want to discuss these results at all?
Sure. I think, you know, it's really consistent with, I think, what we see where a lot of firms manage everything in-house.
Yep.
The ones that have adopted really vertically focused partners get a lot of input around those. We do quarterly business reviews, provide a significant amount of input. We see some people see that as valuable.
Yep. Agreed. That is, it's not really surprising that about half are still managing everything themselves, and likely, you know, that's where the struggles come, really, for capacity or wanting to do new things or add additional value.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. Are we ready for Q&A, guys?
Definitely.
Perfect. So we have a question here. It's sort of a two-parter from somebody. So he's asking, how is cloud safer or more secure than your own internet security, VPN software, etc.? And the second part of his question is, how secure is the cloud, and how could you determine a secure provider?
Sure, I can answer this one. If you look at somebody like Microsoft Azure, who provides the Azure cloud, they've got a huge amount of individuals who are dedicated to securing that environment. The configurations, the services provided are so well vetted and used by really tens of millions of individuals that, you know, that kind of a scale around security you just can't have as a small organization. You know, the edge security, so compared to your firewall that you may purchase and configure, those things are just at a different scale. They also are in compliance with, I think it's over 50 different worldwide regulations. So in order to do that, they've needed to meet, you know, unbelievably rigorous security levels. Kate, any comments?
I would say you also want to make sure that so security is a continuum, and it's not all one thing. It's actually many things. Policy and procedure and end user training all being really critical pieces that remain the responsibility, or at least shared responsibility of your organization. So Microsoft definitely, when it comes to security, you know, having managed on-prem networks for many, many years, even prior to coming into the CPA industry, it is really hard to keep up with unless you have somebody on your staff who's dedicated to it, and even then, it's a difficult thing to keep up with as compared to working with a cloud provider who has a team of security experts, and Microsoft, who, as Bill's just well explained, really invest heavily in security. So not a straightforward answer because there's a lot to it, but I can say this: the likelihood of being more secure, I think, is fairly great, moving from an on-prem solution to a cloud solution.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, guys, for answering that. Here's another question. Why does it seem most companies use a charge-out ticket-based model instead of a shared service cost center model? Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think it's a risk of predictability of costs. As an example, I think, you know, we look at us internally, we do a, you know, supports included, and our expectations because of experience is that we understand what organizations need support-wise. Many use tickets because they're not as confident. And to be fair, if they're not industry-focused, they may not know about your industry. So I think that provides a big variability.
Thank you so much for answering that, Bill. Kate, did you want to say anything, or?
Just that I agree, and when it comes to, in particular, accounting, if you're not with an industry-specific provider, they really are not prepared for the volume of tickets that we get in this industry. It far exceeds what we see in other professional service industries, and that may also be why folks are charging on that model.
Okay, thank you, guys. Here's another question. How do you encourage existing IT leadership to embrace these changes? And is it realistic to think that the same personnel who manage on-prem legacy can pivot to digital and cloud?
I'll take the first part, and then Kate, maybe you can add for the second. On the first part, I think you've got to invite them. You know, we sure have seen where IT has been, you know, somewhat separate and more tactical, but including them in business strategy, including them in firm direction, you know, I think is key, at least including IT leadership, and setting expectations that, you know, alignment is extremely important. Kate, your thoughts?
I would add that there are a lot of skills in your team that was managing on-prem that'll be needed, both, as we were talking about earlier in this talk, deeper in the business, but also to manage maybe at a higher level the folks who are doing the tactical work now that they had done before, if you move to this sort of a model. So I think that you'll see a lot of skills that you'll want to keep. That being said, you know, it really depends on your IT team and what your skill sets are there. So, you know, every company and firm is a little bit different.
And some of those skills you're transferring to the provider. That's where, you know, that's the kind of low-hanging fruit where to look to see, you know, do you have alignment with employee skills?
Thank you so much. Sorry, I jumped in there. This question sort of piggybacks on that a little bit, so I'll wrap up with this question and then we'll close it out. From your experience, does risk management, does that go part and parcel with the vision of the CIO, or should it come from top management? I'm rewording this question as I read it to sort of understand it better. So does that make sense? Does risk management go? Yeah.
Bill, you want to start?
Yeah. So typically we're seeing the requirement, you know, in compliance industries for a Chief Information Security Officer, CISO. Doesn't have to be, or at least a security officer. That may or may not come within the CIO's purview. Risk management is a key piece of not only the technology side, but also the financial side. And so we see that role being shared both with what might be a CFO, alignment with the CFO at least, but depending on exposure, or I should say presentation of results, we really see risk management being elevated higher and higher. Many organizations have at least an annual board review of cybersecurity and, you know, risk management. Kate, you've got some extras?
Sure. So just for some perspective, in large organizations, risk management rolls up under legal. So it's the entire organization. When you're talking about IT, that is one portion of risk for the organization, and it is critical. But really, risk management is a very, very high level, should be managed from the top.
Absolutely. And with that, last word from Kate, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who stayed a little late with us. If you want to contact Bill or Kate, the emails are up there, bill.sorenson@netgaincloud.com and Kate Krupey at CoreBlue Kate and Bill, thank you so much for speaking today. It was a great presentation. And to the attendees, we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.